Snow fell in a blanket of white. There was no sound except for the wind howling through the frost-covered forest. At an altitude of thousands of meters, on the border between China and North Korea, Ed stood still. Before him lay Mount Jinbei, a wild, bitterly cold, and unforgiving land. No guns. No food supplies. No hunting allowed. He had only a backpack, a few minimal tools, and one crucial principle. Survive, but never violate nature. The first day began with a cold farewell and the arrival of a snowstorm. Ed's feet were already slightly injured, but he didn't allow himself to stop. With every step, the 60 cm deep snow seemed to pull him down. When the wind blew so hard that he couldn't open his eyes, he decided to dig into the snow and build a temporary shelter. Tree branches, compacted snow, and a will to survive became his first home, a cold hole, but his only hope. The next morning, Ed smiled to himself in the snow, a small smile in the vast solitude. He crafted snowshoes from Y-shaped branches, tied tightly with vines. Each step became easier. And then, he found his first pine cone. "Protein," he exclaimed. Cracking the shell open, he chewed the tiny seed like a victory. Not enough to be full, but enough to keep going. On the third night, Ed managed to start a small fire with 2 dry branches. He couldn't build a bed. He slept right next to the fire, the only warmth in the sub-zero cold. Before closing his eyes, he took off his shoes and dried his socks, a hard-earned lesson from his survival stint in Siberia that had landed him in the hospital for 3 months. The fourth day brought a big gift, a rainbow trout caught in the trap he set by the river. Unbelievable. Ed held it up like a treasure. He steamed it using forest moss and a bit of water, eating by the fire. It was the most luxurious meal he'd had in days. After the little feast, Ed continued searching, this time for wild fruits, wood sorrel, rao berries, and even the devil's fruit, which tasted like mango. He devoured them, eyes shining like a child who had found buried treasure. As night fell, Ed had to find a new campsite again. He walked barefoot through a swamp, carefully avoiding the venomous snakes locals had warned about. The BNA snakes, known to have a strange liking for bald men. Ed just laughed, "Guess they'd love me." On the 5th day, he caught a crayfish and a few small crabs. Not much, but enough for a mini feast. The fire burned, and the smell of seafood drifted through the mountain forest. And Ed, the bald man in the wild, sat savoring his spoils like a lonely king. On the final day, Ed discovered a cave and a stream full of fish. He sat silently by the water, watching the fish swim as if nature was silently congratulating him. No weapons. No companions. Just himself, nature, and courage. Sometimes, to survive, you don't need to conquer nature. You just need to learn to listen to it. Ed Stafford, survivor, reflecting after his many-day survival journey in Jinbei. Day 6 began with icy wind slapping his face. Before the sun rose, Ed was already up, curled beside the smoldering fire. Each breath turned into mist, reminding him, this was no place for weakness. He followed the stream from yesterday, the same one that had gifted him the best trout of his life. Today, the hope of another swimming meal made his steps light. But nature doesn't repeat its miracles so easily. After more than an hour of searching, what Ed encountered wasn't a fish, nor a crab, but a rattlesnake. He froze. Their eyes met. One man, one wild creature. A few years ago, maybe Ed would have acted first. But this time, he took a step back. "Not today," he whispered, then slowly retreated. Back at camp, he carried a few dry branches and some damp moss on his back. But he didn't return to rest, he returned to build, for the first time, a long-term shelter. Under the thick canopy of a large tree, he built a sloped roof from dry trunks, covering it with a thin layer of snow for insulation. In the freezing forest, it looked like a small, humble cabin, warm and welcoming. That night, the wind raged stronger than ever. Snow flew like a storm. But inside that tiny shelter, Ed lay still, breathing calmly. The fire still burned, and for the first time, he dreamed of peace. Day 7, living as part of the wilderness. At dawn, Ed didn't go out in search of food. He spent nearly an hour just listening, the wind rustling the leaves, the sound of distant water flowing. Nature had nothing to give that day, but it took nothing in return. When the sun rose, he walked again, and suddenly, a deep purple fruit fell from above. He looked up, the tree was full of them. No hesitation, he picked one, took a bite. Sour and sweet. Like mango, but wilder, he thought, smiling. He brought a few back, roasted them by the fire, and turned them into a special dessert. Stafford-style grilled forest jam, as he joked. The last day, the return isn't the end. Before leaving, Ed returned to the riverbank. He set up his camera, framed the shot, then let himself float along the water. Not to escape, but to fully feel the vastness, gentleness, and harshness of nature. At that moment, he was no longer someone challenging nature. He had become a part of it. As he stepped onto solid ground one last time, Ed looked up at the distant mountain, where he had once dug a snow shelter, lit desperate fires, and shared humble meals with the trout. He smiled, not in victory but in understanding. Nature is not something to conquer, but something to listen to and learn to live with. And then, he turned away, leaving behind the snow, the cold wind, and a part of himself that had been forever changed. Back in a world with electricity, hot water, and food waiting in the fridge, Ed sat silently on a wooden chair in his small cabin by the forest. The lights weren't enough to warm his heart right away. The old backpack sat in the corner, still smelling of smoke and earth. The DIY snowshoes were torn beyond repair, but he couldn't throw them away. Every scratch told a story. Every stain, a memory. Out there, I once feared death. But it was also where I learned how to truly live. He opened his laptop, watching the footage he had captured digging the snow hole, tying branches together, breaking pine cones, laughing like a child when he lit his first fire. There were moments, deep in the forest alone, hungry, cold, when he had wanted to give up. But with every frozen night survived, every bite into a dry pine seed, or the discovery of a wild fruit, Ed had never felt more alive. Returning to the world, but never the same. Ed began telling his story, not with heroic bravado, but as someone who had learned to listen. He spoke of sparing the rattlesnake, of making his first pine nut cake, of the surreal peace of drifting in an icy river. People listened. They were moved. But only Ed truly understood. The cost of survival wasn't life, it was awakening. A new dream. Ed didn't stop there. For the first time in years, he began to draw. He sketched the snow cave, the small stream, the old pine tree heavy with fruit. He wrote journals, page by page, not for fame, but to preserve the memories of a man who had once lived like a wolf. Then one day, as the winter wind once again swept across the northern mountains, Ed stood before a map, his eyes shining, as if ready to begin another journey. I don't go to conquer nature. I go, so I don't forget who I am. In this vast world.